Fannie Lou Hamer. She was born in October of 1917 in Mississippi and died in March of 1977 in Mississippi by breast cancer. She was the youngest of 20 children. Her parents were sharecroppers and she had began working at 6 years old and dropped out of school at 12 years old to continue working and help her family. She married Perry Pap Hammer in 1944, but was unable to have children because during a surgery to remove a tumor, she was also given a hysterectomy. In the summer of 1962, she attended a meeting by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which encouraged African Americans to vote. On August 31st of 1962, she, along with 17 others, traveled to the courthouse in Indianola to register. However, they encountered opposition from law enforcement, and she and one other were allowed to fill out an application. After this happened, she was fired from her job and kicked off the plantation that was her home for nearly 20 years. Her involvement often left her in harm's way as well, being threatened, arrested, beaten, and shot at. She was even left with permanent kidney damage after being beaten in jail in 1963. She also helped found the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which opposed her state's all-white delegation to that year's Democratic Convention and announced her bid for Congress. Lastly, she set up organizations to increase business opportunities for minorities, as well as to provide childcare and other services. Daisy Bates. She was born in November of 1914 in Arkansas and died in November of 1999 in Arkansas. Her childhood was filled with tragedy as her mother was assaulted and murdered by 3 white men and her father left, leaving her to be raised by friends of the family. She married an insurance agent and experienced journalist named Lucius Christopher Banks in the early 1940s. Together they operated a newspaper called the Arkansas State Press until it was shut down in 1959. Her husband died in 1980. In 1952, she became president of the Arkansas chapter of the National Association for Advancement of Colored People. In 1954, she chronicled the Brown v. Board of Education case in their newspaper. On September 4, 1957, the Little Rock Nine made their first attempt at attending the all-white school. Many protested and the governor sent the Arkansas National Guard to keep the Little Rock Nine out. When President Dwight D. Eisenhower heard of this, he sent the U.S. federal troops to protect the Little Rock Nine. Her home became the headquarters through all of this, and she became a personal advocate and support for them. Their first successful day was September 25, 1957. She was receiving many threats during this time, and the newspaper was shut down in 1959. In 1962, she published her account of the school integration battle called The Long Shadow of Little Rock. She moved to D.C. to work on the Democratic National Committee and on anti-poverty projects with the Lyndon B. Johnson administration. She moved back to Little Rock in the mid-1960s while spending most of her time working on community programs. After her husband passed, she brought back the newspaper from 1984 to 1988. Bobby Seale. He was born October 22, 1936, in Dallas, Texas. He is the oldest of 3 children. He grew up in poverty with an abusive father. Their struggles followed them through their move. He began to be politically minded while attending Berkeley High School. He joined the Air Force in 1955, but was discharged after an altercation with a superior officer in 1959. He has married twice and has 2 children. He met Huey Newton in September of 1962 at a rally protesting the Kennedy administration's blockade of Cuba. Also during this year, he went to a speech by Malcolm X. These things started his political radicalism. In 1966, the Black Panthers were formed by Seale and Newton with the original intent of protecting the black community from Oakland police. Later, the name changed to Black Panther Party and their intent turned to becoming a new voice in the civil rights movement, rejecting the nonviolence approach and Back to Africa teachings by more radical Black nationalists. In 1968, he began to write Seize the Time, the story of the Black Panther Party and Huey P. Newton. This was published in 1970. Seal and the rest of the Chicago Seven were arrested while protesting at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago for conspiracy to incite riots and circus-like atmosphere. He ended up being sentenced to 4 years in prison for contempt of court in 1970. Also during this time, he was tried for the murder of a fellow Black Panther Party member who was believed to be a police informant. After he was released, he renounced violence in an attempt to end and begin again the task of reorganizing the fallen Black Panther Party. In 1973, he ran for mayor of Oakland. He came in second out of 9. After this, he grew tired of politics. He continued to write 2 books. One was called A Lonely Rage in 1978, and the other was a cookbook called Barbecuing with Bobby in 1987. In 2002, he moved back to Oakland to work with young political activists to spark a social change.
Louis Farrakhan was born in Bronx, New York in 1933 on May 11th. A few years down the road, he gained the nickname Louis X. He was an American religious leader, a civil rights activist, and a social commentator. He had encouragement from Malcolm X to join the Muslim movement in 1955. Also, in 1955, he organized the Million Man March in Washington, D.C., where he brought leaders Jesse Jackson, Rosa Parks, and Betty Shabazz to speak on social issues. A few years later, he created a newspaper called The Final Call. The Final Call was to help and recognize his views to others around this time frame in the 1970s. Louis Farrakhan also led the Nation of Islam. It was the African American movement that combined elements of Islam with Black nationalism since 1978. To this day, he is still remembered for fighting oppression. Malcolm X is another one during the civil rights. He was born in Omaha, Nebraska on May 19, 1925. He was an African American leader, a minister, and a human rights activist. He was also a spokesman for the Nation of Islam during the 1950s and 1960s. In 1946, he was arrested for theft and sentenced to 10 years in jail. He was finally released from prison in 1952, where he then traveled to Detroit, Michigan to work with Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad was the leader of the Nation of Islam. In 1960, he developed a newspaper called Muhammad Speaks, which was to promote the Nation of Islam. Later then, he took a trip to North Africa where he was taught to place American civil rights movement within the context of a global anti-colonial struggle. After his death, he was criticized as a, in quote, violent rabble-rouser. He is also truly remembered from his quote, power in defense of freedom is greater than power in behalf of tyranny and oppression.
The civil rights movement has had many success stories, and perhaps none more successful than the NAACP. The NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was founded in 1909. It was created to address the growing violence towards Black Americans. It is one of the most successful and enduring civil rights groups. Over the years, the association has been scrutinized for their emphasis on legal action over other forms of action, such as protesting, but it is difficult to argue that their methods aren't highly effective. To demonstrate this, here are some notable historical events the NAACP were responsible for or involved with. The 1954 Brown v. Board of Education, which ended segregation in public schools. The 1963 March on Washington, which advocated for African American civil rights. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which did away with voting discrimination. The Greensboro sit-ins was another highly successful event. It occurred in Greensboro, North Carolina, and it began on February the 1st and ended on July 25, 1960. Essentially, 4 men known as the Greensboro Four decided to take a stance against the Woolworth department store's segregated lunch counter. The men basically just sat down at the counter and refused to leave until African Americans were served in the establishment. Word of mouth quickly spread, and it was once a 4-person protest swelled into the hundreds. On July 25, 1960, Woolworth ended its segregated lunch counters, and many other lunch counters followed suit. This event was so successful and inspirational that it directly led to the development of the SNCC. Inspired by the nonviolent actions of the Greensboro sit-in, the SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was designed to involve Black youth in nonviolent political action. This initial action plan was successful, and the SNCC became heavily involved with freedom rides and getting Black Southerners registered to vote. However, as the SNCC became more politically involved, the members encountered greater violence, and this caused the group to become more radicalized. The supporters became known as the shock troops of the revolution. The reputation as the radicalized faction was only enhanced with the election of Stanley Carmichael as the head of the SNCC. He directly associated the SNCC with Black Power, which caused moderates and white supporters to cut ties with the committee. Internal splintering only increased from there, and the SNCC was disbanded in the 1970s. Despite their initial commitment to nonviolence, external social pressures in the form of threats and violence pushed them towards a more confrontational approach, which led to reduced public support and their unfortunately premature end. The civil rights movement faced numerous internal and external challenges. As shown by the SNCC, civil rights groups had to choose between the type of protest they wanted to use through either passive or aggressive means. However, while they were figuring out their particular method of action, they faced extreme political opposition to politicians such as George Wallace and Eugene Conner. George Wallace campaigned against racial integration and was openly oppositional toward issues of discrimination and voting rights of African Americans. He survived an assassination attempt and was re-elected into the governorship. However, in the 1980s, he did reform and work with civil rights groups, which helped him gain the support of Black voters in the 1982 gubernatorial election. But the fact remains that he actively made it more difficult for civil rights groups to attain progress and impeded their success. Similarly, Eugene Conner advocated for racist social policies, and he was even more oppositional than Wallace when it came to civil rights. He purposely refused police protection for the freedom rides and even told the riders they'd be apprehended. Additionally, he ignored racially motivated crimes. His notoriously harsh treatment of protesters eventually made national news. Americans witnessed protesters being sprayed by hoses, harassed by attack dogs, and being arrested. This prompted President JFK to create the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Although Conner was removed from office, he still eventually was re-elected. His political career was entirely centered around helping social change, and it is incredibly impressive what the civil rights groups were able to accomplish despite people in office like him.
Plessy versus Ferguson and Jim Crow laws. In 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson decision by the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the separate but equal doctrine. This case stemmed from Homer Plessy in 1892 refusing to sit in a designated train car for African Americans. As a result, the Jim Crow legislation and separate accommodations based on race became common. The Compromise of 1877 led to the withdrawal of troops from the South. Consolidation of state legislators marked the end of Reconstruction. White supremacy once again took over the South. In 1892, Homer Plessy purchased a train ticket from New Orleans to Covington, Louisiana. He refused to move to a train car designated for African Americans. Plessy was then arrested and convicted for violating the 1890 law. Segregation and black disenfranchisement increased throughout the South. In May of 1896, the Supreme Court delivered the verdict in Plessy versus Ferguson. They declared separate but equal facilities were constitutional on interstate railroads, and the 14th Amendment did not protect social rights, only political and civil rights. The verdict in the Plessy versus Ferguson was enshrined by the separate but equal. The verdict also led to segregated buses, hotels, theaters, swimming pools, and schools. In 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education, Chief Justice Earl Warren stated that the doctrine of separate but equal had no place in public education. He declared that the plaintiffs in the Brown case had been deprived of equal protection under the law of the 14th Amendment. Between the 1800s and 1960s, majority of the states enforced segregation through the Jim Crow laws. Consorting with members of another race could lead to legal punishment. Intermarriage and keeping blacks and whites separate in businesses or public institutions were the most common type of laws. In Georgia, it was unlawful for any amateur white baseball team to play baseball on any vacant lot or baseball diamond within 2 blocks of a playground designated for African Americans, and the same for an African American team playing near an area designated for the white race. In Georgia, a colored barber could not serve as a barber to white women or girls. In Alabama, it was the responsibility of the employer to provide appropriate facilities for both races. In Georgia, an African American could not be buried on ground set apart or used for the burial of a white person. In Florida, any black man and white woman, or vice versa, who were not married to each other shall not habitually live in and occupy the same bedroom, or they could be punished by imprisonment up to 12 months or fined up to $500. In Arizona, any Caucasian blood with a Negro, Mongolian, or Hindu would be null and void. Florida prohibited the marriage of a white person to a black person or between a white person and a person of Negro descent to the fourth generation. Alabama did not allow a white female nurse to be employed by a business where an African American male had been placed. Mississippi had separate accommodations for eating and housing for white and black prisoners. North Carolina did not allow books to be interchangeable between white and colored students, but could be used repeatedly by the race first using them. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was first proposed by President John F. Kennedy. The Civil Rights Act survived strong opposition from the South and was signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended segregation in public places and banned discrimination for employment based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. After the Civil War, slavery was abolished, former slaves were made citizens, and all men were given the right to vote. Many Southern states used poll taxes and literacy tests to prevent African Americans from voting. John F. Kennedy entered office in 1961. He initially delayed supporting the new anti-discrimination issues, but after a brutal protest, he was forced to act. In June of 1963, he stated, "The United States will not fully be free until all of its citizens are free." Lyndon B. Johnson became the president after the assassination of President Kennedy. In his first congressional meeting, he said, "Let this session of Congress be known as the session which did more for civil rights than the last 100 years." A Virginia segregationists introduced a bill to ban employment discrimination against women. Senator Robert Byrd, a former KKK member, spoke for 14 consecutive hours. The Senate voted 73 to 23 in favor of the House. They approved the bill with bipartisan support of a vote of 290 to 130. Johnson signed it into law July 2nd of 1964. Segregation on race, religion, or national origin was banned in all courthouses, parks, restaurants, theaters, sports arenas, and hotels. Created an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The Civil Rights Act did not allow the use of any federal funds for any discriminatory program, and allowed the Office of Education to help in desegregation in schools. Martin Luther King Jr. stated that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was nothing less than a second emancipation. Later, it was expanded to protect disabled Americans, the elderly, and women in collegiate athletics. The Civil Rights Act paved the way for Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Central High School. Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka in 1954 ruled that segregation of America's schools was unconstitutional. Resistance to the ruling forced the court to issue a second ruling in 1955 known as Brown 2. This ruling ordered school districts to integrate with deliberate speed. Little Rock chose to gradually integrate the school after pressure from the NAACP. In 1957, Little Rock high schools began integrations. Two pro-segregation groups formed to oppose the plan: the Capital Citizens Council and the Mothers League of Central High School. 9 students were registered to be the first African Americans to attend Central High School. Daisy Gaston Bates, president of the Arkansas NAACP and the co-publisher of the Arkansas State Press, vetted the students. It was decided they had the strength and determination to face the trials ahead of them. The governor of Arkansas called the National Guard to block the entry into the school. The Mothers League also held a protest against integration. Federal Judge Davies ruled that desegregation would continue as planned. September 25, 1957, the Little Rock Nine was escorted for their first full day of school. The 9 students experienced harassment and were beaten. Ernest Green became the first black student to graduate in 1958. The governor closed all Little Rock schools for a year pending a vote. 19,470 to 7,561 votes against integration, and the schools remained closed. Many of the 9 went on to be to have distinguished careers. In 1999, President Clinton awarded the 9 all a Congressional Gold Medal, and they were also invited to the inauguration of President Barack Obama.